Path of Exile, a game about walking down a path, a lot of paths, as an exile. But really, it's a spiritual successor to Diablo 2 with the materia system of Final Fantasy VII and the sphere grid system of Final Fantasy X. Is a pretty good model of free-to-play, a ton of content, and is in fact very fun. You've probably heard of it, you've probably played it. I mean, why else would you be here? You might ask what this video is about. It's about the Path of Exile, you moron. But really, I just want to talk about the game, its mechanics, and why I love it. Someone who has never played and is curious about it will probably get the most out of this video. But maybe you're just in love with the game and want to hear someone talk about it. Maybe you're experiencing a content drought in the electronic universe and desperately need to hear someone else's voice in the void of your lonely existence. Maybe you just want to listen to someone talk about something you probably know more than them about, just to correct them in the comments. If you fill any of these qualifiers, welcome. Path of Exile is a dungeon crawler action RPG, and what that means is that it's the kind of game where you turn on a banger and tune out the rest of the world and get lost in that grind. While that might sound simplistic, I assure you that isn't the case. On the surface, what you see might look incredibly basic, and you certainly could boil the game down to I press button and kill thing, but there's a lot more meat on these bones once you start to scratch the surface. The first choice comes down to where you will be playing your character. Standard is the base game, which is where everything ends up after the current Challenge League. In Standard, you will not experience whatever the current Challenge League offers to the game. So, you want to play in whatever the current Challenge League is. You also have the option of SSF, which means Solo Self-Found, which does not allow you to play or trade with other players. The other option being Hardcore, making all deaths quote-unquote permanent, only in that once you die, you are booted straight into the Standard League with that character and no way back to the Challenge League. If you are new to the game, I highly recommend playing the game just on the current Challenge League. SSF and Hardcore can be fun challenges, and where probably all of your favorite streamers are playing, but if you're just looking to have fun, or to learn the game, you don't want to start there. Now, after choosing where to make your character, there is the most important choice: what class to play. This might seem like a simple choice, but let me explain why it isn't by breaking down each one of them, because each class branches off into 3 different subclasses. Every class is also represented by the attribute points of the game: Strength, which gives you life and physical damage; Intelligence, which gives you energy shield, effectively blue life, and mana; and Dexterity. Dex gives you accuracy and evasion. And the representation determines where they start on the passive tree, which I'll explain in greater detail shortly. And while the passive tree might look daunting, it's something you quickly get the hang of. I'll give some examples of what builds the classes are good at, but make no mistake, that does not mean they are limited to these builds. First, you have the Templar, a hybrid of strength and intelligence. He is an arthritic old man with dementia who forgot his pants back on Oriath before he became an exile, thinking it was his retirement plan. His Guardian subclass focuses on, surprisingly, taking a beating or summoning his extended family to fight for him. The Hairy Elephant, the Fire Hydrant.
Hierophant.
Hydropants specializes in dealing damage with spells and totems. Lastly, the Inquisitor excels in dealing elemental damage by completely negating enemy resistances with critical hits. Second, you have the Shadow, a hybrid of intelligence and dexterity. This is actually the origin story of the Outsider from Dishonored. His Assassin subclass excels at critically hitting with attacks and spells. The Saboteur focuses on dealing damage with traps and mines. And lastly, his Trickster subclass excels at dealing damage over time. The Shadow as a whole does its best to negate damage with evasion and dodge, most of the time. Third, you have the Marauder. He represents strength. He's big, he's dumb, and he's ready to crack open your skull. His Juggernaut subclass focuses on being able to take a hit and dish out some decent melee damage. The Chieftain focuses on dealing fire and totem damage, while also being able to take a bit of a hit. And lastly, you have the Berserker, the best subclass in the game if you're looking to take even more damage. Sign up today to die even faster in a game that's all about not dying. Though he does get some good damage boosts and buffs to rage and war cries along the way. Fourth, you have the Ranger, who takes the dexterity role. She's agile and autistic. Her Deadeye subclass makes her one hell of a shot with a bow. The Raider is a versatile subclass that gives her a lot of flat bonuses, opening up many bow, melee, or elemental builds. Lastly, her Pathfinder turns her into an alcoholic, making her chug potions better than anyone else, as well as getting some chaos and poison buffs. Like the Shadow, the Ranger's mitigation usually focuses on evasion and dodging. Fifth, you have the Duelist, who represents strength and dexterity. His raw sexual energy was considered a crime. As no one else could realistically compare, he was sent away in exile. For his Gladiator subclass, he dons his Russell Crowe cosplay and raises his shield to block almost everything in the game, while dealing excellent bleeding and physical damage. The Champion is great at staying alive and dealing damage by getting a free Fortify, which he buffs, and carrying a banner with him, and dealing increased damage with Impales. Lastly, the Slayer focuses on ripping the flesh off his enemies while they're still alive, and sustains himself by drinking their blood and bathing in their final moments. He is always hungry, and is never enough. Sixth, you have the Witch. She represents intelligence. A sassy, small-titty goth GF with a penchant for raising the dead. Her Necromancer subclass is best for basically every pet-based build. The Elementalist is excellent with, you guessed it, elemental spells, but also granting herself amazing buffs by summoning multiple golems. And lastly, her Occultist subclass focuses on cursing her enemies, and dealing more chaos and cold damage over time. You may have noticed I skipped one, the Scion. She's unique in that she represents all of the attributes and starts smack dab in the middle of the passive tree. She is the jack of all trades, master of none. The problem in a game designed in the pursuit of becoming an unstoppable mass of genocidal destruction, being the master of none is often a hindrance. She dabs in to steal some passives from up to 2 classes, but they're weaker versions of the original. This can make for some cool combos, but rarely is it better than just focusing on the original class. Still, I think she's pretty neat. However, if it's your first time, you can't start with her, as you'll need to unlock her early on in the game first on someone else by playing through the story. Once you first find her, she's permanently in your roster. Once you choose your class and come up with a completely lore-friendly name, you're thrown onto the shores as an exile. Nothing to your name except some smelly ratty rags. From here, the world of Path of Exile opens up to you as you quest through the 10 acts to reach the end game. Now, before you commit to your first character, there are a few things you should both consider and understand. First thing to realize is if you go into this game blind, your first character is going to be a complete and utter failure. If you're okay with that, that's fine. Get in the game, get slapped, and learn the hard way. But if that doesn't sound fun to you, you should first either try to gain a base understanding of the skill system and the passive tree, or browse the Path of Exile forums and find a build someone else has tailored for a newbie like you. But you need to be careful, as there are a lot of builds out there that are noob traps. They'll claim you get millions of DPS while being the tankiest damn thing on the planet, but when you try it out, you get one shot and you deal no DPS at all. What happened? A couple of things more than likely. 1. The build wasn't designed as a starter build, so be sure to try to find one that advertises itself as a League starter build. Their build probably requires you to farm a lot of endgame currency to even afford to be able to attempt to do a portion of what that build can do. A lot of builds even require specific items to even be able to do what they're supposed to do. Or 2, they are what I like to call a POB warrior. Now, if you're new here, you heard a few things you don't understand yet. The skills, passives, currency, POB, leagues. Let's go over all that. Let's go ahead and start with currency, as currency is one of the most important mechanics in this game. Now, do note, most of what I'm about to say is only viable when you make your character where trade is allowed. Otherwise, currency is basically only as valuable as the mechanics they offer. Path of Exile has no true standard like gold, bits, or gil. Currency items are items of their own, each with a unique mechanic they offer to the game. Their worth is distinguished by 2 things: the usefulness behind the mechanic, and the rarity of how often they drop. For example, you will see endless seas of Scroll of Wisdom. These are used to identify the effects of any item of magic quality or higher. You will always need them, and they're plentiful. Then, for example, there is the Chaos Orb. A rare enough drop, with a useful enough mechanic that in a way they become the standard of which other currencies are either traded up to or down to. Then there are items like the Exalted Orb, which are rare enough to be considered very valuable, usually requiring anywhere between 80 to 150 Chaos Orbs depending on the market at the time. Then there are the especially rare currency items like the Mirror, the item which in my 10,000 rough hours of playtime in this game, I have personally still never seen. Let's give a quick example right now. When I made this, you could trade roughly 90 Chaos Orbs to get one Exalted Orb. Whereas to get one of these mirrors, it would require 850 Exalted Orbs. In my opinion, the best way when you're starting fresh is to pick up most of the rares you come across, vendor all of them. And some of the rares you find might actually be worth something along the way. Try to just quickly look for stats like High Life and Resists or Energy Shield or something that catches your eye. Otherwise, get it the hell out of here. Are you going to vendor something important at some point? Yeah, probably. What is important is that you identify the item beforehand. If you sell an unidentified rare, you will only get transmutation shards/orbs. But if you identify them, you gain alteration and alchemy shards or orbs, which are more valuable. If you ever run low on Scrolls of Wisdom, remember, you can directly vendor Blacksmith's Whetstones and Armorer's Scrap for a decent amount of Scrolls of Wisdom. And any extra portal scrolls you have can be traded at a ratio of 1:1 for Scrolls of Wisdom. If you do this, you will end up with a decent amount of alteration and alchemy orbs, which can be traded up to Chaos, or if you have enough, even a few Exalted, which will be used to buy the first few items of whatever build you've decided on to get you rolling in endgame content. Speaking of deciding your build, we should go over the skill system. If you've ever played Final Fantasy VII and know how the materia system works, you're pretty much good to go. Otherwise, it's still incredibly easy to understand. There are skill gems. Some are considered active, and some are considered support. You'll notice gear has colored slots in them. These skill gems can be placed in the slots of gear, matching the skill gem's color. You use your support gems to enhance the performance of active skill gems. How do you do this? By making sure they are linked together on the gear they are placed in. If a support gem is not linked together with an active gem, they'll do nothing together. This is where 3 currency items come in very handy. Fusing orbs are used to reroll whether or not the sockets on a piece of armor are linked. Jeweler's orbs are used to reroll the base number of sockets on an item. Note that increasing the quality of an item increases the chances of rolling a higher number of sockets and whether or not they will be linked. A lower leveled item might not have what the maximum amount of sockets can be. Normal pieces of armor like gloves and helmet can roll 4 sockets, where a chest piece can roll 6. A 2-handed weapon can also roll 6, but 1-handed weapons and shields can only roll 3. Chromatic orbs are used to re-roll the socket colors of an item, so you can get the perfect matchup. Do note that armor, energy shield, and evasion are representative of the attribute points strength, intelligence, and dexterity, or red, blue, and green respectively. This matters because if you use a chromatic orb on an item that only has a base of armor, red sockets are far more likely to appear, whereas blue and green are less likely. So, if you have an armor piece that has energy shield and evasion as its base, you are far more likely to roll blue and green sockets. Most builds come down to using 1 active skill as your damage, being supported by up to 5, which is why you will usually socket your main active skill in your body armor or a 2-handed weapon. But you will also use a handful of other base active skills for utility like mobility and survivability. But as is with everything in Path of Exile, that's not always the case, but more often than not it is. Let me give you an example of some of the characters I've messed with this league, and what character classes they are, and why they work. Which is where I will also go into more depth with the passive tree. Let's start with my Gladiator. In my opinion, a Gladiator that focuses on block is one of the best core starter builds for new players and new leagues in the game right now. For most basic encounters, you're tanky enough that you don't have to worry too much about dying, but you will still get slapped by the harder mechanics, so you're forced to learn exactly what you need to avoid. You might ask, why play such a tanky no-brain character? Well, that's simple. Whenever I'm playing Path of Exile, I'm simultaneously pushing toward floor 4 million in Soda Dungeon, getting first place in the current Adventure Capitalist event, resetting runs constantly in idle champions, and doing very important research. Now, while this build is great for a lot of physical-based attacks, we're going to focus on applying a bleed with the skill Earthquake. Let me explain why. Earthquake hits first, and then after a short time explodes again for more damage. This is important for a few reasons. First, you need to understand that wording is very important in this game. For example, increased damage is an additive bonus that pools together, and then that overall percent of increased damage increases your flat damage. Quote, more damage is a multiplicative bonus, which means each more is multiplied separately. For example, let's say you deal 150 damage with your weapon, with an overall, quote, increased damage pool of 100%, and 2 different instances of 20% more damage. You would calculate that by first increasing your 150 flat damage by the 100%, which is 300, then by your first 20%, getting you to 360, then another 20%, finally getting you to 432. Now you can see why stacking as many more modifiers can be very crucial for a build to just skyrocket their damage. So back to the Gladiator. I mentioned it's a bleed build, so what we're going to focus on is making sure every physical melee hit applies a damage over time bleed effect. We accomplish this with a combination of the support gem, Chance to Bleed, and getting as many Chance to Bleed on hit bonuses that are on the passive tree. Remember, you can always search for something specific on the passive tree. You'll notice, however, after all of this we're only at 90% chance. Don't worry, as many pieces of gear, namely weapons, will also offer a Chance to Bleed property as well. So we'll need one of those. Namely, in the endgame, a specific, unique weapon called Jack the Axe. Technically, you could find or craft a rare one-handed weapon that will deal more overall damage, but Jack offers us good damage, caps our Chance to Bleed, a 25 to 35 damage over time multiplier bonus, a buff that takes up a bit of your health bar to offer some crazy health regeneration, as well as another 20% more damage with bleeding multiplier. On top of this, it's very cheap to buy from other players and not too difficult to farm on your own if need be. Also, I find weapons that talk to you incredibly fun. There's another mechanic that makes this build truly work, and that is war cries. A war cry is a skill that, once used, grants a buff depending on the skill, and usually allows you to exert an attack. Exerted attacks consume the exert effect to deal increased damage. We combine 2 different war cries to scale the damage of Earthquake as high as we can, effectively increasing the bleed it applies, as a bleed's damage is based on the highest physical damage dealt by a hit. Let's first take a look at Seismic Cry. Once used, you get 4 charges of this exert buff, granting 30% more damage and 30% increased AoE, which scales with each exert. That means on the 4th exerted attack, 120% more damage and 120% increased area of effect. That's a lot of damage, but we're not done yet. Next, we also weave in Intimidating Cry, which, when exerted, flat doubles the damage of a hit. Just like that. If you happen to actually hit the enemies around you with the war cry itself when you use it, they will also become intimidated, which is an effect that increases all physical damage they take on top of overwhelming a percent of their physical damage mitigation, based on how many mobs you hit with the war cry. I recommend supporting Intimidating Cry with the second wind support gem, as this will give it 2 charges. Since Intimidating Cry only exerts 2 attacks, you will need to use it more often than Seismic Cry. However, saving Intimidating Cry only for the 4th hit of Seismic is completely viable, as only the hardest hitting bleed will be active on an enemy at a time. Now, remember, Earthquake is slow, but the aftershock from the second hit of the skill deals 150% more damage on top of all of this. Since this build focuses on dealing 1 hard hit in a large area, it's perfect for applying 1 extreme bleed on everything as well. Now, since we're a gladiator, we also focus on using a shield to block, so we also need to pick up as many block and shield passives that are on the passive tree as we can as well. So let's do a quick search for block and pick those little bastards up. Remember, when you block an attack, you will fully block the damage from the attack, or spell, because we're gladiator. But this only affects hits. Some enemy skills don't technically hit and just deal damage. These will still be dangerous, so keep an eye out. Also beware of bad stuff on the ground. This can't be blocked either. Now, the most important thing from here is to make sure we pick up as many life nodes as we can, both along the way to our bleed and block buffs, and to make sure that when we inevitably do take some damage, we can actually survive. One of the most common mistakes by beginners is to take as many damage nodes as they can, thinking they'll just blitz through everything. This will lead you to an early grave and a hard wall blocking your progress. Trust me, you need life, be it the red or blue variety. You know what else you need? Resistances. I'll keep it short and simple here because it's just that easy. Reach your elemental resist cap, which is a base of 75%. The end. As early as you can and maintain it. How do you do this? Mostly with gear, sometimes with passives. If that's not enough, hell, use an aura and reserve some of your mana to reach it. Would you rather use a damage aura? Sure. Will people make fun of you for using a resist aura? Yeah, maybe. But you don't know anyone or play with anyone anyway, right? So just don't. What about chaos resistance? That one can be a bit tricky, but I also recommend getting it completely to your cap, or at least as close as you can. Chaos damage is a bit rarer to run into, sure, but almost every league the game tends to add a lot more ways to die to it. So just cap it, man, I'm telling ya. Let's shelf the Earthquake or Bleed blocker for a moment and talk about another character. I decided to give another Warcry a shot with a Berserker. This Warcry works a lot differently than a normal Warcry though. With General's Cry, you actually link the Warcry to an active melee attack skill. If there are any nearby corpses, you will call up some dead boys to attack with the linked skill. So the question then becomes, what skill should I use? Well, I ended up with one called Earth Shatter. Why pick that one? Well, it hits pretty hard, but more importantly is that when it slams, it leaves behind spikes that blow up for extra damage when you use a Warcry. So, your first General's Cry, you create a bunch of spikes, and then each subsequent use of General's Cry erupts those spikes for extra damage, creating a potent cycle of AoE destruction. Now, why Berserker? Well, they offer some good buffs to Warcries, and the flat more damage doesn't hurt. Well, technically it does, since I'm taking that increased damage at the same time. So we have to make sure we have means to heal ourselves. Thankfully, in the passive tree we can find a fitting way to do that, as well as using Enduring Cry here and there for some good passive regen. One problem with the build, it requires corpses. How to start that cycle rolling when you haven't killed anything yet? Simple. Fabricate your own. We do this through the skill Desecrate, either by using it itself or linking it to another skill, such as Cyclone, to cast it while channeling, supplying us with an endless tap of decaying corpses. Another build I tried to make, specifically for the Challenge League mechanic, for the hell of it, I made a Guardian designed to take as much of a beating as possible. This is attained by using auras to reserve both my mana and my life. But by doing so, I also increase my armor and energy shield, capping out my block as well, gaining energy shield back on block based on armor. Pretty good cycle. So now the question is what skill to use for damage when I'm focusing so hard on defense. So I decided to use a high damage AoE ability, Penance Brand. Brand skills attached to an enemy for a duration, inflicting whatever mechanic that specific brand skill does over the duration. Penance Brand stores up energy by tickling the enemy it is attached to, with a little electric shock, increased by any nearby enemies that also get tickled. Eventually, after a duration, or upon reaching max tickle stacks, the damn thing erupts in a nuclear explosion of decimating everything on screen. I have to admit, seeing Penance Brand blow up everything on screen during an ultimatum is quite satisfying. Overall sounds really solid, right? You might ask, what's its weakness? It has one giant glaring thick weakness: boss killing. When you don't have a lot of enemies near each other, those tickles don't stack up very fast, so that big boom takes a while, which is incredibly important, especially on enemies with large health pools. That said, that can be one reason to have multiple characters. One, like my Penance Brand Geriatric, who excels at shotgunning the hell out of clusters of cannon fodder, turning them into electrified meat paste, and another who knows how to handle the big daddy boss mans. I guess this would be a good point to break off and talk about challenge leagues. A league is, in a way, the current in-game event going on in Path of Exile. These usually last about 3 months, and if the in-game mechanic is good enough, it will be added to the core Path of Exile game as more content. Also note, anytime you create a character in an ongoing league, that first character starts completely fresh, and none of the characters you create in that league will have access to anything from standard. But anybody in that league, as long as you are not solo self-found, will be able to share items they find. Let's start out by explaining the current league that's going on when I made this video, Ultimatum, which, by the time I put up this video, Ultimatum will probably be over cause I'm slow. The premise of this league is rather simple. You'll run into the Trial Master, a sassy little bitch who will either egg you on or whine that you're doing good.
Is this some farcical joke? One loss is nothing to be ashamed of. Your victories will not continue. This time you will finally lose. I'm being punished, aren't I? Can you be victorious twice in a row? You've been winning, but can you keep it up?
You'll be tasked with either completing a challenge of killing monsters, standing in some circles, not dying, or protecting an altar. If you succeed in a wave, you'll be rewarded, or you'll be tantalized with another reward if you attempt and succeed in that next wave. If you die or run away, you lose everything. If you beat all of the waves he has ready for you, or you give up after successfully completing your current wave, you gain all of the rewards up to that point. The rewards vary from meh to okay, not bad, to damn, I was gonna stop on that last wave, but I gotta go for that now. Each time you start, and every wave after, you have to choose something to make it even harder, be it a nerf to yourself or a buff to the enemies you face. These can get quite difficult at many stages of the game. However, if you're a Giga Chad and lucky enough, you might run into a fight with a Trial Master himself later in the game. Like most challenge leagues win their current content, you'll run into this mechanic in every zone, well, most of them, other than towns, boss zones, and small side areas. It's a pretty simple league, but one that I have personally enjoyed. There is one thing that was added to this league that borderline arouses me though, pausing. In between deciding whether or not you're going to stop and take your rewards, or push to another wave, the game literally pauses. To my knowledge, you cannot pause this game by any other method, especially for a league designed to give you a difficult choice in whether or not to try to take on the harder challenge, or if you just need a breather and won't die while you're AFK looking up some important questions. I personally love this. I said that if a league was good enough, it often gets implemented into the core game. I'm not positive if Ultimatum will or not, but I'll briefly go over the ones that have to give you an example of things that have come and might give you some kind of idea of what might be in the future. From the older leagues, there have been some minor things added to the game, such as stumbling upon Rogue Exiles, a slightly harder than average enemy that drops slightly above average loot. The Ambush League added strong boxes that once you try to open, spawn enemies who try to defend the loot you are so gracefully taking for yourself. The Bloodlines and Nemesis League added potent buffs to rare and magic monster packs to increase their difficulty and rewards. While there were other leagues that added small things to the game, I want to get to where I personally believe leagues in PoE really started to find their niche as a challenge league, which is Parandus. It's somewhat similar to Ambush in that you're going after a chest that is defended by enemies, but when you loot the chest you also find a currency based solely on the league. This currency can be used to trade with a league-specific NPC you stumble across for whatever item he might be offering at the time. These items can range from completely worthless to incredibly good. Most leagues after Parandus were added to the core game in a big way, adding many unique items and permanent in-game mechanics. So I'm going to quickly cover most of them without going into too great a detail. Prophecy. You find silver coins to give to a fortune teller so she can tell your future, creating an encounter based on the prophecy. Essence. Find creatures trapped in ice. Release them so you can swiftly murder them and claim their essence, which are basically just orbs of alchemy nudged in a specific crafting direction. Breach. The first league to introduce one of the most common and for some reason fun mechanics in the game. Circles. When you walk over a breach, it starts to expand and summons monsters to slaughter. Kill as many as you can before the circle shrinks and be rewarded with a giant loot explosion. 90% of this loot will be useless, but it was still fun. Breach also added league-specific boss encounters, which added some niche but fun uniques to the game that are still used in decent builds to this day. Harbinger. Added enemies with easy-to-pronounce names that summon minions you decimate for the reward of currency shards that you stack up to equal the actual currency. At first it might seem underwhelming, but when you start to find exalted shards or maybe even mere shards, you might start to understand the value. Abyss. Step on the writhing crack on the ground, chase it down as it tries to flee from you, kill all the monsters and be rewarded with a chest. If you're lucky, you might even venture deeper into the abyssal depths to find either a spire to slap down, or if you're even luckier, a boss lich for some unique loot. Bestiary. Hunt down beasts for a mentally challenged outcast named Einhar.
Do not worry, little beast. We are friends now. We will be best friends, beast, until we slaughter you.
So you can keep them caged in captivity until you're ready to murder them like the filth they are and offer their impure blood on a blood altar so you can, craft items. Yeah, okay. Incursion. Quest with the NPC Alva, who can somehow warp you into the past, so you can invade some old temple and shape it to your design. Do this floor by floor until you're finally ready to see what your past shenanigans have led to in the present, in a large dungeon that, if you did it right, ends with a boss encounter and is rewarding for the time invested. Delve. Work with a social outcast who spends his time huffing fumes to dig as deep in the planet as you can. Gather sulfide for him to power his machines to delve deeper and deeper in his azurite mine. You can find items that help you to craft, currencies, unique items, boss encounters. I mean, really, you can find just about anything deep in the infinite depths of the delve. Betrayal. This league shook everything up by removing the masters players had grown and accustomed to questing with, and instead made them bosses to murder. Again, and again, and again. Work with June to hunt down the mastermind of the Immortal Syndicate, and work with one of the most complicated mechanics in the game, as you find members to murder, interrogate, or bargain with. Connect all of the dots and follow your hard work to find your way to the mastermind for ultimate rewards, just to do it all over again. Legion. Find monoliths that have frozen in a great battle of the past, and throw yourself into the fray as a one-man army, standing against the odds of all 5 warring factions to murder every single soldier of every single army and take everything they own as a spoil of your single-minded war. Blight. Work with Cassia, a sassy nun, to play Path of Exile's version of tower defense. Upon successfully defending a lane, you are rewarded with a chest of goodies. Blight added the mechanic of anointing items, allowing you to add a notable skill from the passive tree to an amulet to be active without spending a passive point on said notable. Metamorph. Work with Tane Octavius, a mad scientist who has you gather bits and pieces from monsters in a zone so you can breathe life into your own monstrosity, just to murder it all over again for that sweet loot. Delirium. Spot yourself in a mirror and think, damn, that's one fine specimen of a human being, and embrace yourself, which covers the zone you're located in the fog of delirium. This fog starts spawning new creatures as well as empowering those already in the zone. This fog eventually recedes and you're rewarded for what you were able to murder in the allotted time. This league added cluster jewels to the game, a mechanic that made people lose their mind, as these clusters are socketed into your passive tree to offer you even more passive options, vastly opening builds, changing the best in slot for current builds at the time, and making POB warriors all the more unbearable. I've talked about POB a couple times, and I guess I should really elaborate on what that is. Path of Building. It's a third-party tool that you can use to fully plan your passive tree, items you might want to find, and it calculates the damage of the skills you've linked within the program. It's a great way to pre-plan a build, but be very careful you don't set standards too high and don't quite reach the goals you set for yourself. But I highly recommend looking it over just to get a base understanding of the passive tree, items you might want, how damage works in the game. It offers a lot of utility. Harvest. Heist. Work with a ragtag band of criminals to steal from people for your own profit. But of course, make sure you murder as many people you can along the way, because that's how thieving works. Or was that the mafia? Plot out your crimes, level up your rogue buddies to give them unique bonuses, and start opening doors just so you can die to lose literally everything in that heist. Ritual. Embellished on the idea of circles. Murder mobs around a ritual altar, then interact with it to force yourself into a circle of spawning mobs to murder. After doing this with every altar in the zone, you will have stocked up enough of your blood sacrifices to purchase some items from a loot pool. Ritual was fun since it allowed you to choose your own rewards from the pool instead of being completely random. And that leaves us with the current league of when this video was made, Ultimatum, which honestly just feels like a variation of Ritual that was hit or miss with people, but like I said, I'm rather fond of it, even if it's a bit minimalist. Now, these are a lot of game mechanics to take it, but the thing is, these are all just things that can happen while leveling and in the end game, but is not required or particularly the goal of the game. But to be honest, that's part of what I love about this game. Make your own damn goals. Who cares what other people think? If you just want to focus on a specific league and its content, do it. But I should touch up on the, quote, actual end game, which is the Atlas and map farming. Once you have completed the main story of the game, you're offered access to a map device. Maps are a tangible currency that you can alter with other currencies, just like other items. Their rarity affects what modifiers can be on the map, making them more difficult, but also more rewarding. This atlas might look confusing and hard to understand, and that's because, to be honest, it kind of is. I'll cover it briefly, but if you want to go into more depth, I recommend finding a guide elsewhere. As you start to complete maps, you'll see you're checking them off a list in your atlas. Each time you complete a map for the first time under the conditions set for the map, which you can see directly on the atlas, you get a tiny permanent buff to map drops, a 1% chance for them to drop as one tier higher. So completing as many different maps as you can is what you want to do. You'll also notice as you map along the way that there's some people that start to show up and start messing with your atlas. These are conquerors. When they show up, they engulf an entire region in their color, of which there is crimson, golden, cobalt, and viridian. And no, I'm not just being fancy, because when you eventually kill them, you will loot a watchstone named after their color. These watchstones are placed into your atlas to increase the tier of maps that drop in that region. So, how do you kill them? Well, as you complete maps in the region they are influencing, they will spawn a portal after you kill the boss of a map, which you take to encounter their fight. When they show up as an encounter is represented here on the atlas. And anytime a map is directly influenced by them, there is a possibility of gear dropping to have affixes unique to that conqueror, which in turn makes that gear's art look way cooler than it has any right to. Once you've slapped around these conquerors, eventually their daddy will show up to tell you it's time to square up. Cirrus is super serious, especially for newer players, and can be a quite difficult fight. Promises to be rewarding, but like most promises Daddy makes, he doesn't often deliver. Cirrus's difficulty is directly tied to how many of the watchstones you have equipped on your atlas at the time you open the portals to fight him. For each 4 slotted watchstones, your Awakener level goes up by 1, to a maximum of 8, which will be shown on your atlas here. If you're a pussy and can't handle a harder Cirrus, you can always remove any watchstones before you summon his portals. Now, along the way of slapping down conquerors and getting slapped by Cirrus, you will notice another presence, an emissary that speaks of the Maven, and then she herself who shows up to make a map boss more difficult. Once she witnesses your glorious murder of the boss, she stores them in her Pokeballs. Once you've seen her collect enough, she makes a boss encounter that involves all of the bosses she has gathered from that region, then throws them all at you to fight. If you succeed in this encounter, you will unlock passive points, but for your atlas. Each region will eventually unlock a smaller passive tree, which offers unique bonuses for maps in that region. Most of these passives are directly tied to league mechanics, often forcing encounters on maps of that region that are otherwise difficult or impossible to find. While there may be best-in-slot ways to spend these passive points, I recommend spending them on what encounters you find the most interesting, as there are always a currency to re-roll if you really end up hating what you choose. Once you've completed all possible encounters, you will have 10 points per region to use, so use them wisely. At the end of the day, when you've slaughtered everything, looted every unique in the game, maybe you just want to hang out in your hideout and get to decorating. Especially if you're into trading, you'll note some very fancy hideout layouts. Or maybe you have money to spare and just want to look dope as hell. In which case, that is one of the rare times in this game you will need real money. I haven't talked about it much, but I should probably go over the monetization of this game. Overall, all content in the game is completely free. The only thing that a lot of people feel is required are bank tabs. Specifically, you'll need at least one premium stash tab, so you can, in a way, list items so other players can view them from the trade site. There's no true auction house to this game, unfortunately, but the trade scene is very active. Other than that, there are tabs to cover most of your needs as far as organization and never running out of room for all your random looties. But at the end of the day, my most recommended tabs if you're looking to buy is the currency tab and the map tab. If you catch it on a tab sale, you'll only really ever need to spend, $15 to $30 to be completely set. And even that's not truly required to play the game. I think it's a pretty damn good bang for your buck for a game like this. If you don't want to look like a hobo, that's a different story altogether though. If you want to get your PoE drip flowing like the Nile, you're gonna have to bleed some green. And while I understand a lot of games you have to play for fashion, if that's your style in PoE, it might break your bank a bit. Honestly, I could keep going on about this game, because while I've covered a lot of the basics and mechanics, there is so much more. All of this, and at the end of the day, I'm not even that good at the game, but I still have a blast with it. And I think a lot of people would as well. Even with how popular it is, I know there's still more people out there who haven't tried it yet. If you haven't given it a try, you should do so. It's free. If you haven't played it in a while, pick it back up for a new league. If you've burnt yourself out and starting to hate the game, take a step back, take a breather, but it'll probably inevitably pull you back in. I don't know what I'm doing here, as you've obviously figured out by now, but if you somehow made your way to the end here, hey, thank you. If you even more unlikely enjoyed your time here, I don't know, maybe throw a like and sub, because who knows, I might start rolling out more content. If that sounds interesting to you for some reason, don't hesitate to let me know by leaving a comment on what you might want to hear me blabber about next. Have a hell of a time out there, Exiles.